A desperate thief storms into a liquor store, gun in hand, ready to make a quick score. But what he doesn't know, the quiet cashier he's threatening has survived far worse, and he's about to learn that the hard way. Franklin's Liquor and Spirits wasn't much to look at. A small shop on the corner of Valencia and Sycamore in Tucson, Arizona, just a few miles from the interstate. It was the kind of place where regulars came in for their usual, barely making eye contact as they slid crumpled bills across the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a tired yellow glow. Behind the register, Daryl Cunningham leaned against the counter, absently wiping down a section that was already clean. It was almost midnight, just 30 minutes before closing. The air smelled like cheap beer and floor cleaner, the same way it had every night for the past 6 months. He didn't mind the routine. In fact, he preferred it. After 4 tours in Iraq, Daryl had come back to a world that felt distant. He didn't talk much, didn't go out of his way to make friends. Civilians didn't understand what it meant to live with your back against the wall. Every breath a gamble. So he kept things simple. Go to work, go home, repeat. It wasn't exciting, but it was quiet. And quiet was something he could control. But tonight, quiet wasn't on the menu. The store was empty except for one guy in the back, scanning the beer fridge like he was looking for the meaning of life in a 6-pack. Daryl glanced at the clock. 11:32 p.m. A few more minutes, and he could start counting the register, lock up, and head home. Maybe heat up some leftovers. Watch something mindless on TV. Then the door chime jingled. Daryl barely looked up at first. Just another late-night customer, probably grabbing something for the road. But something felt off. The guy who walked in was moving too fast, like he was trying to psych himself up for something. Hoodie pulled low, hands stuffed into the front pocket. Eyes scanning the store, not the shelves. Daryl didn't tense up, didn't make a sudden move. He just watched. Situational awareness. It had kept him alive overseas, and it was second nature now. The beer guy in the back had noticed too. He hesitated, looking between Daryl and the newcomer, then quietly set his can down and slipped out the side door without saying a word. Smart man. The guy in the hoodie stopped a few feet from the counter. Ryan Belasco, though Daryl wouldn't know his name until much later. Mid-30s, gaunt face, sunken eyes, the look of a man who had been losing for a long time. Daryl didn't say anything, just waited. Ryan's hands twitched inside his hoodie pocket. Then, a single movement. Fast, but sloppy. The gun came up. Not steady, not controlled, just desperate. Empty the register. Now. His voice wavered. Daryl caught the way his fingers wrapped around the grip, the way the barrel bobbed slightly. He wasn't a professional. A professional would have kept his breathing steady. A professional wouldn't have let his fear show in his stance. But a scared man was dangerous in ways most people didn't realize, because fear makes people unpredictable. Daryl didn't flinch, didn't even blink. This was not the first time someone had pointed a gun at him. But Ryan didn't know that yet. He tilted his head slightly, scanning for details. 9mm, cheap model, safety off. No suppressor, no gloves. This wasn't a plan. This was a last resort. And men with nothing to lose? They were the hardest ones to control. But control was something Daryl had spent years mastering. Ryan licked his lips, his grip tightening. I said, Daryl raised one hand, slow and deliberate. I heard you. His voice was calm, too calm. Ryan wasn't expecting that. But expectation was about to mean nothing. Ryan's breathing was uneven, shallow. His fingers twitched on the grip, a telltale sign of someone teetering between fear and reckless desperation. The gun, a high-point C9, cheap and unreliable, wobbled slightly as he tried to steady his hand. Daryl saw all of it, but he also saw something else. Ryan hadn't pulled the trigger yet. That meant something. If this were just about killing, he wouldn't have given a warning. This wasn't a man set on bloodshed. This was a man out of options. Still, a man out of options could be just as dangerous. Daryl kept his expression blank. No sudden movements, no signs of defiance. Not yet. His hands hovered near the register, slow and deliberate. "You're nervous," he said evenly. "That's bad for both of us." Ryan's jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the door, then back. "Shut up and do what I said." "I am." Daryl didn't break eye contact. "But you don't want to do this." Ryan let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah? What the hell do you know about what I want?" "A lot more than you think," Daryl wanted to say. But instead he moved. Just a little. Just enough. He tapped a button on the register, and the old machine let out a soft beep before the cash drawer slid open. Ryan flinched at the noise. His hand jerked, the gun rising just an inch higher. Too jumpy. Too unstable. Daryl made a note of it. He pulled a few bills from the tray, moving with the kind of deliberate patience that made it clear he wasn't going to fight. That's what Ryan needed to believe. That's what kept a man like this from pulling the trigger. But Daryl wasn't just stalling. He was watching, calculating. The gun, the angle, the stance, the spacing. Ryan was about 5 feet away, just close enough for a fast move if Daryl picked the right moment. But not yet. Ryan's gaze flicked to the bills in Daryl's hand. All of it. Not just that. Daryl didn't argue. He reached for more cash, keeping his movements predictable, non-threatening. Outside, a car rumbled past. The headlights sent a quick flash of light through the store's glass window. Ryan tensed. Another tell. Daryl had seen it before. Men in combat zones, waiting for the next explosion. The kind of instinct that made you flinch at shadows. This guy had been living in survival mode long before he walked through that door. Ryan's foot shifted. A minor adjustment, but enough for Daryl to see the shake in his knee. The weight imbalance. The hesitation. He was scared, and scared men make mistakes. Daryl knew that, but the problem was, so do cornered ones. Ryan's eyes flickered toward the door again. Something was racing through his mind. He was debating something. That was bad. Daryl's heart rate stayed steady. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. And the thing about men like Ryan, they weren't built for real violence. They thought they were. But they weren't. The question was, how long until Ryan realized that? Because the second he did, everything was going to change. Daryl wasn't just looking at Ryan. He was reading him. Every twitch, every movement, every glance toward the door told a story. Ryan's grip on the gun was wrong. Too tight. His knuckles were bone white. His fingers locked like he thought squeezing harder would make him more dangerous. That told Daryl 2 things. 1, Ryan wasn't used to handling a firearm. Probably stole it. Maybe bought it off the street. Either way, he wasn't trained. 2, he was trying to convince himself he was in control. And the moment someone tries to convince themselves of something, it means they aren't sure. Daryl let the silence stretch a little longer. Made Ryan sit in it. He placed more bills on the counter. "You're shaking, man." His voice was calm, measured. "You don't want to be here." Ryan's breath hitched. "Just for a second." "Shut up. Just give me the money." "You got a plan for after this?" Daryl asked, not because he expected an answer, but because he needed Ryan thinking about something other than pulling the trigger. Ryan scoffed, but it wasn't as sharp as before. His bravado was slipping. "What the hell do you care? You don't know me." "No, but I know this isn't you." Daryl let his words settle. A real killer wouldn't hesitate. "But you keep looking at the door like you're waiting for an excuse to run." That landed. Daryl could see it land. Ryan's jaw clenched, his stance shifting just a little. He hated that Daryl had called him out. Hated it because it was true. Daryl stayed loose. He was still behind the counter, still at arm's length. But now he had something else. A rhythm. A combat instructor once told him, "You don't fight the enemy's strength. You fight their mind." And Ryan's mind. It was already fraying. Daryl flicked his eyes toward the gun. "Safety's off, huh?" Ryan hesitated, then nodded. Daryl nodded back, slow. "That's good." Ryan frowned, confused. "Good? Why the hell is that good?" Daryl let out a small breath, like he was thinking something over. "Because if you'd walked in here with it on, it means you never really planned on using it. But you did." He let the words sit for just a second. "And now you gotta decide what happens next." Ryan's Adam's apple bobbed. His fingers twitched again. His gun hand lowered an inch. That was all Daryl needed to see. The cracks were getting wider. Ryan might have walked in here thinking he had the power, but power wasn't in the gun. It was in the mind of the man holding it. And right now, that man was losing it. But the problem with desperation? It's unpredictable. Ryan suddenly jerked forward. "Stop talking!" His voice cracked. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? I will shoot you." Daryl didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just stared back, unmoved. "No, you won't." Ryan's breath caught, because for the first time since he walked into this store, he wasn't the one in control anymore, and that terrified him. Ryan blinked. Just once, but Daryl caught it. That split-second hesitation, the kind that gives away everything. The gun was still pointed at him, but the threat was slipping. Ryan knew it, and now Daryl knew that he knew it. The space between them suddenly felt smaller. Daryl stayed still, his hands near the register, giving Ryan nothing to react to. Because that's how this worked. If you give a scared man something to push against, he'll push. But if you give him nothing, he collapses under his own weight. Ryan swallowed hard. His fingers twitched on the trigger again. The muzzle of the gun dipped slightly, just enough to tell Daryl that Ryan's body was betraying his mind. He wasn't here to kill anyone. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. But a desperate man. That was still dangerous. Desperation makes people do stupid things. Daryl finally spoke. Low. Measured. No fear. No anger. Just fact. "If you were going to shoot me, you would have done it by now." Ryan flinched, just barely. But it was there. His pupils flickered, searching for something to latch onto, some way to prove he was still in control. Daryl didn't give him that. He nodded at the gun. "Safety's off. You've got a clear shot." His voice never wavered. "But you haven't pulled the trigger, not because you can't, because you don't want to." Ryan's breathing picked up. He hated this, hated the truth in it. "Shut up. Just give me the rest of the money." But Daryl ignored that. "Who's waiting for you?" Ryan's eyes flickered. "What? Who's waiting for you when you walk out of here?" That was it. The question. The one that cracked through whatever walls Ryan had left. His lips parted, but he didn't speak, because he didn't have an answer. Daryl had seen it before. Soldiers who'd lost everything. The ones who made it back, but never really made it back. Ryan wasn't a soldier, but he had the look of a man who'd been fighting a different kind of war. Daryl's voice softened, just enough. "You got kids?" Ryan's face twitched. His bottom lip trembled, just barely. Daryl knew that look too. Regret. Shame. The weight of too many wrong choices. "I had a daughter," Ryan muttered, voice so low it almost wasn't there. "Haven't seen her in a while." Daryl nodded, slow. "You want her seeing you like this?" That was the breaking point. Ryan's grip on the gun loosened. Not by much. Just enough. Daryl saw his shot. And when a man like him sees an opening, he takes it. Daryl moved. Not fast, not aggressive, just controlled. Ryan barely registered it. His mind was already spinning, caught between the weight of his choices and the gun in his hand. But Daryl saw everything. The way Ryan's wrist slackened, the way his shoulders sagged, the way his breathing had gone from erratic to shaky. The fight was leaving him, and that was the moment. Daryl's left hand shot up, not for the gun, but for Ryan's wrist, a quick, practiced motion. The kind of move that only came from muscle memory, not thought. Before Ryan could react, Daryl twisted. A sharp, downward yank, pressure on the joint, not enough to break it, just enough to make the pain override instinct. Ryan let out a strangled noise. His grip failed for half a second. That's all it took. Daryl's right hand clamped over the slide of the pistol, pushing it upward, making sure the barrel pointed toward the ceiling. A struggle, a gasp. Ryan's body lurched forward as he tried to regain control, but Daryl was already ahead of him. A pivot of his hip, a shift in weight. Ryan stumbled. The gun fell, and Daryl caught it. Just like that, the tables turned. Ryan staggered backward, hands raised instinctively. He wasn't even trying to fight anymore. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling like a man who'd just realized he'd made the worst mistake of his life. Daryl ejected the magazine with a quick press of his thumb, then racked the slide to clear the chamber. The bullet clattered onto the counter. The room was silent. Ryan's eyes locked onto the disarmed weapon. His hands trembled at his sides. Daryl exhaled slowly. He didn't feel the rush most people would expect. No adrenaline high, no shaky hands. This was just another job. He slid the empty gun across the counter. "That what you wanted?" His voice was low, even. "To see what happens when you pull something like this on the wrong person." Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. His throat bobbed, his face pale. Daryl leaned forward just a little. Just enough to make sure Ryan understood. "You never had control." Ryan blinked, swallowed. He looked at the gun, then at Daryl, then at his own shaking hands. He wasn't just scared now, he was ashamed. Daryl could see it all over him, the weight of it. The sudden realization of how close he'd come to something he never wanted to do. And that was why Daryl didn't call 911 yet. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. Ryan stood there, shoulders hunched, breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The fight had drained out of him. Daryl didn't move. He let the silence stretch, let Ryan sit in it. Sometimes a man needed to hear the weight of his own choices before he could understand them. The gun lay on the counter, harmless now. But Ryan wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the floor. Daryl exhaled. "You ever killed a man before?" Ryan's eyes snapped up, startled. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no words came. Daryl didn't need him to answer. He already knew. "I have," he said, voice even. Not bragging, not confessing, just stating a fact. "And I can promise you, it's not something you ever walk away from clean." Ryan's lip trembled. His hands flexed at his sides like he wanted to hide how much they were shaking. Daryl leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What were you going to do, huh? Walk out of here with a few $100? And then what? Buy yourself a few more days before everything catches up with you?" Ryan swallowed hard. I didn't think that far." "Yeah, that's the problem." Ryan wiped a sleeve across his face. Daryl could tell he was fighting something, holding back whatever storm was raging inside him. "You said you had a daughter," Daryl continued. "What's her name?" Ryan flinched. "Melanie." His voice cracked on the word. Daryl nodded slowly. "She know what her dad's out here doing?" Ryan's jaw clenched. His eyes glistened, but he refused to let anything fall. Daryl let that sit for a second. Then he picked up the empty gun and turned it in his hands. "You ever held one of these before tonight?" Ryan shook his head, barely more than a twitch. "Then you didn't come in here planning to shoot me." Daryl set the gun back down. "Which means you got lucky." Ryan let out a ragged breath. "Lucky?" He laughed, but it was hollow. "I feel like the biggest idiot alive right now." "You should." Daryl didn't sugarcoat it. "But feeling like an idiot ain't the worst thing. Feeling like a murderer, that's something you never shake." Ryan sniffed, looking anywhere but at Daryl. "So what happens now? You calling the cops?" Daryl studied him. He could see it now, the weight, the regret, the fear. Not the kind of fear that makes a man dangerous, the kind that makes him realize he's standing on the edge of a cliff, and tonight someone just stopped him from falling. He exhaled sharply, picked up the cash from the counter and shoved it back in the register. Then he slid the gun back toward Ryan. Ryan flinched. "What?" Daryl's eyes locked onto his, cold, certain. "You got a choice." His voice was low, firm. "Walk out that door and keep going down this road, or turn around and fix whatever the hell put you here in the first place." Ryan stared at the gun, like it was something he barely recognized anymore. Then slowly, with trembling hands, he pushed it back across the counter. "I don't want it," he whispered. Daryl nodded. "Then go home." Ryan's throat bobbed. He turned, hands still shaking, and walked toward the door. When he reached it, he hesitated, looked back. "Why are you letting me go?" His voice was hoarse, raw. Daryl exhaled. "Because someone once gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, and I don't believe in wasting lessons." Ryan swallowed hard. Then, without another word, he stepped out into the night. Daryl waited until he was gone, then picked up the gun. He'd call it in. Tell the cops someone left a weapon at the store, but he wouldn't mention Ryan. Some battles, a man had to fight on his own. Life isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after you've made them. Some people go too far, and there's no coming back. But others, they just need a moment, a second chance, a reason to step off the path before it's too late. Maybe Ryan would take that chance. Maybe he wouldn't, but tonight at least, he walked away with his soul intact.